I thought my grandson's birthday would be the memory I carried with me into old age. Bright balloons, sticky cake on little fingers, his laughter echoing through the house. Instead, what I remember most is the silence that came after. It arrived the very next morning, a heavy, unnatural silence that made the house feel unfamiliar. I woke before sunrise, as I always did, but the air felt different. Even the floorboards beneath my slippers seemed careful not to creak. I stood in the hallway and listened, expecting to hear my grandson humming to himself like he usually did when he woke early. There was nothing. And in that nothing, a strange unease settled in my chest. My grandson, Daniel, had turned 8 the day before. He was a gentle child, the kind who apologized to chairs he bumped into and saved the biggest piece of chicken for me at dinner. He had my son's eyes, but a softness that was entirely his own. Watching him grow had been the quiet joy of my later years. The party had been simple but warm. Family crowded our small living room. My daughter-in-law laughed louder than usual. My son filmed everything, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to keep the camera steady. Daniel smiled through it all, polite and grateful, but there were moments, small ones, when his smile faded too quickly. I remember catching his eye while everyone sang. For a second he looked distant, not sad, just far away. Then he blinked, and he was my Daniel again. After the guests left and the wrapping paper was swept into black trash bags, the house should have returned to its usual comfort. But that night, I woke to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. I assumed Daniel was going to the bathroom. Children his age often wandered half asleep. But the footsteps didn't stop. They paced slowly back and forth, deliberate and steady. I opened my bedroom door a crack. The hallway was dim, lit only by the orange glow of a streetlight outside. Daniel stood there, facing the wall. His shoulders were stiff, his hands clenched at his sides. "Daniel," I whispered. He didn't turn around. I stepped closer, my heart tapping nervously against my ribs. When I touched his shoulder, he flinched as if waking from a deep dream. He looked at me, his eyes wide and glassy. "Grandma," he said softly, "I thought I heard someone calling me." The house was silent. I told myself it was just a nightmare. Children imagine things. I led him back to bed, smoothed his hair, and stayed until his breathing slowed. But as I walked back to my room, I felt watched. The walls seemed to hold their breath. In the following days, small things began to pile up like stones in my shoe, impossible to ignore once you notice them. Daniel grew quiet. He stopped humming in the mornings. He ate less, pushing his food around his plate with careful circles. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the front door, his face tight with an emotion I couldn't name. One afternoon, I found him sitting alone in the backyard, clutching a crumpled piece of wrapping paper from his birthday. He was whispering to it. "Daniel," I called gently, "who are you talking to?" He startled and hid the paper behind his back. "No one," he said too quickly. That evening, my son and daughter-in-law argued in the kitchen. They thought I couldn't hear them over the television, but age sharpens certain senses. Their voices were low and urgent. "You promised we tell her," my daughter-in-law hissed. "Not now," my son replied. "It's not the right time." My stomach tightened. "Tell me what?" When I entered the kitchen, their conversation died mid-sentence. They smiled at me, brittle, rehearsed smiles. I felt like an intruder in my own home. The tension seeped into everything. Doors closed more softly. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. And Daniel, he began to have nightmares, real ones. He would wake screaming, his small body trembling as if gripped by an invisible cold. One night, I sat beside him as he cried. Between ragged breaths, he clutched my hand. "Grandma," he whispered, "am I going away?" The question struck me like a slap. "Of course not," I said, though my voice wavered. "Why would you think that?" He hesitated, tears shining on his cheeks. "Because Mommy said my other family might come back." The room tilted. I felt the air leave my lungs in a slow, painful exhale. Other family. The words echoed in my head, heavy and sharp. I smoothed his hair and murmured reassurances until he fell asleep, but inside me, a storm had already begun. The next morning, I confronted my son. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had fed him as a child. His hands trembled around his coffee mug. "Tell me the truth," I said quietly, "all of it." For a long time, he couldn't meet my eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. "Daniel isn't biologically ours," he confessed. "We adopted him when he was a baby. It was supposed to be closed, permanent, but his birth mother contacted us last month. She wants custody. She says she's ready to be his mother now." The words settled over me like ash. I thought of Daniel's distant stare during the birthday song, of his whispers to crumpled paper, of the fear in his voice when he asked if he was going away. He had overheard everything. A child's world suddenly cracked open. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my throat burning. "We were afraid," my son said. "Afraid you'd love him differently." A bitter ache spread through my chest. Love him differently? As if blood were the measure of love. As if the 8 years of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and shared laughter could be erased by a piece of paper. That evening, we sat Daniel down together. My son explained in gentle, halting words. My daughter-in-law cried silently. I held Daniel's hand as the truth unfolded. He listened without interrupting. When my son finished, Daniel turned to me. His eyes searched my face, desperate and fragile. "Grandma," he asked, "am I still yours?" In that moment, every fear, every secret, every fragile thread holding our family together came into focus. I pulled him into my arms and held him so tightly I could feel his heart racing against mine. "You have always been mine," I whispered, "and you always will be." But love, I learned that night, is not a shield against reality. Weeks later, the legal battles began. Strangers with clipboards walked through our home, evaluating our lives with polite smiles. Daniel grew quieter, carrying a sadness too heavy for his small shoulders. The house changed. The laughter that once filled it became cautious, as if afraid to disturb the uncertainty hanging over us. Sometimes I caught Daniel staring at family photos, tracing our faces with his finger, memorizing us. The strangest thing was not the footsteps or the whispers or the silence that followed the birthday. It was the way a single truth, hidden for years, could rearrange the shape of a family overnight. We are still waiting for the court's decision. Every day feels suspended between hope and fear. Daniel sleeps in his room down the hall, and I often stand outside his door, listening to his steady breathing, reassuring myself that he is still here. But I no longer take that sound for granted. Because after his birthday, I learned that love is not only about holding on. Sometimes, it is about facing the terrifying possibility of letting go and loving just as fiercely anyway. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the house is wrapped in that same heavy silence, I understand something I didn't before. The scariest secrets are not the ones that haunt houses. They are the ones that haunt hearts.